So here we are at the first lesson of Blender, and through this series I'm going to try anyway to take you through Blender step by step, from the very beginning, from the time we first open it up. As we're going through the tools, I'm going to try and explain to you the relevant parts of all the tools, or all of the tools that we will be using. Blender is a very complex program. There's lots of stuff in it, and for the purposes of Second Life and virtual world grids, a lot of it we don't need. We won't use. We won't ever use it. So really, there's no need for us to be concentrating on that. We just need to know what we need and how to use it. So that's what we'll be doing. When you first open up Blender, you'll see this splash screen, and that'll tell you the version number, which in this case the latest is version 2.78. Something unique to each version is this graphic changes. So as the version changes, did I say version? As the version changes, so does this graphic. You probably won't have these recent here. Blender, when it opens up, remembers your recent files, and it's just a quick way to select them. And there's also the recovered last session. We'll be going through that later. If you're coming from Maya or 3ds Max, Blender does have an option to change the key mapping to something similar, but I would highly recommend against this. The reason I would recommend against it is, as you're following tutorials and you're finding tutorials, they will almost certainly use the Blender mapping, and you'll get lost if you're trying to follow tutorials with a different key mapping. So I would leave that as Blender. Okay, to get rid of the splash screen, just click anywhere on the screen and it disappears. If you do, for some reason, want it back, help splash screen. Okay. Right, so Blender. We get Blender from the Blender Foundation, Blender.org. It's a free and open source software. Okay, you can download it, you can compile it yourself, you can get the source code, you can do whatever you want with it. Basically, it's licensed under GNU license, which pretty much means do what you want, but give credits where they're asked for. So to download Blender is from blender.org, and you can download from this button here, and this button will always be the latest stable version. So go to the page, and you've got a number of options for downloading. It'll work with Windows, it'll work with Mac OS X, and it'll work with Linux. You've got 32 and 64-bit versions. Apart from the Mac, it's only 64. I'm not a Mac user, so I'm guessing Mac only has 64-bit computers now. And you just choose your nearest mirror and download. With the Windows, there's an installer or a zip file. The zip file will unzip to a folder, and then you can start Blender from within that folder. The installer will install it as a Windows program, and it'll appear on the start menu and so on. Okay, now what do we need to run Blender? Well, here are the requirements. It says minimum hardware is a 32-bit dual-core 2 GHz CPU with SSE2 support. Now, SSE2 support, SSE2 has been around since the Pentium processors, so any processor you got that is after Pentium will have SSE2 support, so don't worry about that. Okay, 2 GB RAM. Well, if you're running Windows 7 or above, that's kind of like the minimum RAM you'd need anyway. Obviously, the more RAM you've got, the better. I personally have 8 GB, which is under the recommended. 24-bit 1280 by 768 display. Now, as you're working with Blender, you'll find there are times when there's the real estate on the screen, the space you got on your screen is kind of smaller. So the larger display you got, the better. It will work on a smaller display. So if you've got a laptop or an older laptop or something with like a more the square type display rather than widescreen, it will still work. Now it says mouse or trackpad. Now here is where I would say not trackpad. If you're working with Blender seriously, a trackpad is seriously limiting. It denies you of a lot of easy functions, you know, and it'll hinder your workflow. So if you all you've got is the trackpad, I would recommend just going out and getting a mouse. You know, mice are fairly cheap these days, and I'm sorry for that dinging. I seem to have a loose cable on my mouse. Mice are fairly cheap these days, but you want this kind of mouse, not the furry kind. So this would be known as a 3-button mouse. Although it looks like 2 buttons and a scroll wheel, if you actually press on your scroll wheel, you will hear a click and it actually acts as a 3rd button. And I mean, I've seen these around for a couple of dollars, a couple of pound, and that's all you need. You can go for a more expensive mouse, obviously, but to get you started, that's all you need is a cheap mouse. Okay, OpenGL 2.1 compatible graphics with 512 megabyte RAM. Pretty much any graphics card will run Blender. Obviously the more expensive cards will improve your speed and render quality, but pretty much any will run it. So they're your minimum hardware requirements. Okay, let's go back into Blender. And here we are at the default scene. Okay, so let's just run through what we got on the scene here. Blender is broke up into kind of several areas. By default it comes up like this. This area on your left is known as your toolbar. And as you kind of change your operating modes, what appears here will change. So if I go into edit mode, you'll see this is changed and the tabs have changed. So it is context sensitive. There are times when it's kind of in your way and you don't want to say you need more space on the screen. You can get rid of that and open it again just simply by pressing the T key. Okay, or the other way is just clicking the little plus sign up here. Okay, on the other side it's hidden away by default, but we have the properties toolbar. So once again we can expand that, or we can get rid of it with the N key. Okay, and the properties toolbar tells you bits about the actual mesh or the geometry you're working on. And once again it's context sensitive, so if I was going to an edit mode, you'll see the things here change. Okay, but it'll tell you things that you will need to know, things like the location, rotation, the scale, the actual dimensions of the object. There's a whole lot of other options that we can get to. Nothing too much to concern yourself with there right now. I'm just going to collapse this for the minute by pressing the N key. And in the default scene we have a cube, a camera, and a lamp. This lamp actually I believe is a sun lamp. Let me just... no, it's a point lamp. We'll go into differences of lamps later. But we have a cube, a camera and a lamp. Now for the purposes of starting up, I would recommend deleting the camera and the lamp. Okay, so to do that we'll just highlight. We highlight in Blender, by the way, with a right click, not a left click. It's a little counterintuitive, but you soon get used to that. So highlight the object you want, in this case the point lamp, and I'll press delete to get rid of it. It'll ask me to confirm. I'll do the same with the camera. Delete, it'll ask me to confirm. Okay, that leaves us with just the cube. Now it depends on what kind of things you're modelling, whether you want to start with the cube or start with something else. So you can leave the cube, but generally, just for quickness of starting up in a new project, I delete it and just put in the kind of object I want straight away. So I'm going to delete that too. Okay. Now to save these settings as part of your startup, we can go into File and save this as a startup file. So next time we open Blender, this is what we should see. If for any reason you want to go back to the default, you can come to File again and load factory settings, and that will reset everything the way it was. Okay, so let me just get rid of these again. I wasn't confirming the delete, I was just pressing the delete key. Okay, so what do we have here? We have a grid, and you'll see we've got a red and a green axis, and I believe if we go onto display, we can also show a Z-axis or a Z-axis depending where you're from. Okay, I turn that off by default because Z is straight up, straight down. Now it just so happens that these axes, or axi, who knows, these axes correspond with the Second Life axes. You'll find some programs where they'll have Z forward or Y up or something like that. These axes have changed, but with Blender it does correspond exactly. So when you look in Second Life and you edit an object and you see the three arrows, the red, green and blue, they're in the same orientation as they are in Blender. That makes life a lot easier for us. We also have this little red and white circle thing, okay, and this is known as your 3D cursor. And by left clicking anywhere on the screen you can move this cursor. Okay, you might think, well, why? But it's actually a very handy way of defining where you are in 3D space, especially when you're adding a new object. If we were to add a new cube, it'll add with the origin where the 3D cursor is. Okay, so let's just do that. I'm going to press, well, actually no, I'll do it that long way. Object, no, sorry, add. I'm going to add a mesh, add mesh, and I'll add a cube. And you see the cube adds with the center at the 3D cursor. If I was to change the location of that 3D cursor again, and this time I'll use the keyboard shortcut, which is Shift A. So Shift A, add a mesh, and add a cube. It'll add it wherever my 3D cursor was placed. Okay, it's easy to get lost where your 3D cursor is, but in our properties panel it'll always tell you the location, and the location is relative to the center of the grid. Okay, we're just going to pause there for a few minutes and have a class discussion just to make sure everyone's following and catching up.